What else?
Why did you reveal yourself in a book full of historical inaccuracies and theological contradictions?
There are a lot of claims about those two types of things. Hard to know which ones she's talking about. So I'm not going to get into all of them because it was there are literal YouTube channels with thousands of hours of content just addressing these kinds of questions. And so there's plenty of stuff. Check out Sean. Why can't I think of his name right now? No. Evidence that demands a verdict. McDowell. Check out Sean McDowell. He's got a ton of stuff. He's a very active YouTuber, debating atheists, talking through all these things, answering all sorts of questions in depth. He teaches apologetics at Biola University in Southern California. Dude knows his stuff. He's got tons and tons of hours on all sorts of things. A specific contradictions and theological, debates and conflicts or supposed things. The thing I will say is that as a whole, a couple of things. One, scripture is fully accurate in everything it's trying to accomplish. Some people will try and look at the gospel accounts and try and line them up and go, well, these things happen out of order in these two, therefore they're contradictory. No, they were presented that way for a specific purpose in that gospel. Sometimes it's themed out where it's like Luke packs a whole bunch of teaching about the same topic together. They probably didn't all happen in one moment. There were probably a bunch of different teachings that Luke collected and arranged in that spot just to lay it out, like, look at all the different times Jesus talked about this. Just because they didn't happen in that particular order or before or after all these things doesn't mean that that wasn't accurate or historically correct or anything like that. It just, or that it conflicts with the other ones. It's just the same thing, or, parallel events being presented in a particular order for a particular purpose. So for the purpose that it's presented in, it's all accurate information. It's all accurate things. He's reflecting correctly the things that Jesus said. There are some things about potential historical inaccuracies in timelines or various countries or cities or that kind of thing, the rulers at various places and all that kind of stuff. The majority of those things have been proven to be true through history, both within Scripture and third-party secular history. Historians have validated both Old and New Testament events and places and locations and times and all those types of things. And on top of that, archaeology and sociology and written and oral histories all tend to line up and give a lot of validity to Scripture. And there are more and more discoveries made all the time that validate various things in Scripture. And so human exploration of our past tends toward continuing to validate the biblical accounts. You look it up. That's accurate. On the theological side, there's a way of misinterpreting what it says and then claiming that it conflicts with itself. There are theological eternal consequences for how we understand this, that the stakes are high. So it's important that if this is, if we want to assume this is true, it shouldn't be contradicting itself. If it's accurately reflecting an understanding of who God is, it shouldn't contradict itself. So if we look at anything in Scripture that seems to contradict, and again, I don't have a specific example to address and point out why it does or does not or how that works, because she didn't give any. She just kind of threw that out as a general question. So the general response is, if it seems like it contradicts, if there's a way of understanding, you have this part here and this part here, and maybe the way you read that on its own, it doesn't line up with this, but then you take them in consideration of one another and go, okay, is there a way of validly understanding each of these things that they don't conflict, but instead support one another? Yes. Everything in Scripture. I've been reading this thing for 20 years. I've been studying it. I've been to school for it. I've got a degree in it. I've taken lots of classes in it. I've done tons of study in and out of school and various things and trained and read it repeatedly, in depth, all throughout itself. There are ways of understanding the scripture and reading through valid ways. I'm not saying like, oh, you got to come up with secret codes and things. Just looking at any potential contradictions and then exploring where those seem to contradict with something else, and then asking the question, if these seem to contradict, is there a way to understand it where they actually come into alignment? Yes, there always is. There's always a way to bring that back into and to reconcile it with itself, using scripture to interpret scripture rather than just using our own ideas and going, well, that said this and this said that, so therefore it's contradictory. When that's not the only way to understand that thing. And given the light of the other one, that sheds some light on it so we can understand. So in my experience, in my study and everything else, I don't find the scripture to be contradictory theologically, especially, and I also don't find it to be historically or scientifically inaccurate, especially when we can take into consideration things like metaphor and the intent of the scripture, and using that as our initial filter before making judgments about what it says about other things, whether it's history or setup or anything else, because you can take all sorts of things out of context. I can do all things through a verse taken out of context. Straight out of context, I can make this say whatever I want. But that's true with anything. That's what Twitter is, right? That's TikTok. You grab people out of context and use a little 3-second, 5-second snippet of what they said. And there's a lot of like stitches where people come back and like, yo, you stitched that in a way that made it sound like I was saying something I wasn't, and then you rebutted it in a way that addresses something I wasn't. But she didn't really present much for us to address. So general principles, it holds up.